The subject of our lecture is the death of history and the hope of Christianity. Very much looking forward to what Dr. Sarah Irving Stonebreaker is going to say about this subject, because I know she's been working on this subject, this material, just for us. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, right. She's Dr. Irving Stonebreaker is Senior Lecturer in Modern European History and teaches in history and political history and political thought major at the University of Western Sydney. She was awarded her PhD in history from Cambridge University, where she was a Commonwealth Scholar at King's College. She took her BA with first class honours and the University Medal from the University of Sydney in 2003. And if you Google her name, you will discover that when she was a student at Winona, she did very well in the HSC. Is that correct?
Clearly you Googled me.
Yes, I did Google that. When I say very well, I mean very, very well. So you can look that up at your leisure. Dr. Irving Stonebreaker and I actually overlapped while we were at the University of Oxford, though we did not meet. Her first book was awarded the Royal Society of Literature and the Jerwood Foundation Award for Non-Fiction. It was entitled Natural Science and the Origins of the British Empire. And this book investigates the way that England's colonial empire became tied to the Protestant redemptive project of restoring humanity's original dominion over nature. And it's such a fine book that it was reissued in 2016 in paperback, which in the academic world is a sign that the book is really quite a good book. Before joining the University of Western Sydney, Dr. Irving Stonebreaker was a junior research fellow at Wolfson College in Oxford and then assistant professor at Florida State University. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Sarah Irving Stonebreaker here tonight, and indeed her family as well. And so I invite her, without any further ado, welcoming you here and welcoming those who are watching online as well, to deliver her lecture. Will you greet her?
Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I'm going to just make sure that our technology is going to be okay. Here we are. Well, thank you again for that introduction, Michael. It is a real honour and a privilege to be giving the St Mark's lecture tonight, particularly in such a beautiful historical building, very appropriate given the topic tonight as well. So I'm excited to share with you a new research project tonight, which will hopefully be in book form soon. But this is the first time I've really talked about this new research project. So, as you know, the title tonight is The Death of History, but the Hope of Christianity. In our culture today, there's a strange set of attitudes toward history. On the one hand, there's a highly politicised approach to the past, in which people care passionately about history's symbols and what they represent. Witness the recent protests about and tearing down of statues across the Western world. And yet, we know less than ever about history, and we're losing the ability to grapple with the ethical complexities of the past. And then there's the fact that in our culture, life is oriented around self-invention and fulfillment. We have largely ceased to think of ourselves as historical beings. So what's going on here? I want to suggest that there is a growing crisis of history in the contemporary West. It amounts to what I've termed the death of history because Western societies have almost completely lost the ability meaningfully to engage with the past. So in this lecture tonight, I want to do four things. Firstly, I'll outline this broad crisis of history in our culture. Then, secondly, I'll touch briefly upon the fact that these cultural trends are seeping into some parts of the Christian church. Then thirdly, in the third section, I'll turn to the hope offered by Christianity. And there I'll present a Christian vision of tending and keeping time. Not just an academic pursuit of history, but how we deal with tending and keeping time at a popular level, and how this enables us to grapple with the crisis of history in our culture. And then fourth and finally, I'll outline how this Christian vision of tending and keeping time enables us to shape the habits and the practices of the Christian life. So, in section 1, I want to consider 3 features of this crisis of history in our contemporary culture. And the first one I've called the death of the historical subject. Let me explain what I mean by that. In contemporary Western societies, the central idea of what constitutes human flourishing is self-expression and self-actualization. Now, a few weeks ago, I was talking to my undergraduate students, and I asked them to describe our culture's vision of what life is all about. And their answers were really interesting, and there was some version of this. I'll quote one of my students here: finding and then being your true self. So this is a culture that emphasizes highly individualistic self-creation of our identities and our lifestyles. The cultural axioms of today, which we see everywhere, these are the kind of things that you see in slogans for advertising, for things like clothing, even to private schools. They embody this idea that one's true potential needs to be unleashed, and in fact that this is the key to life, which is all about finding your personal vision of happiness and well-being through self-fulfillment. Now, the American sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton perceptively described the culture of what they called therapeutic individualism. Here's what they mean by that. I'll quote them. Therapeutic individualism defines the individual self as the source and standard of authentic moral knowledge and authority, and individual self-fulfillment as the preoccupying purpose of life. Subjective personal experience is the touchstone of all that is authentic, right, and true. By contrast, this ethos views the external traditions, obligations, and institutions of society as inauthentic and often illegitimate constraints on morality and behaviour from which individuals must be emancipated. End of quote. So our culture promotes the idea that there are no real authorities or communities outside of ourselves which might demand something of us, something to which we might have some duty, or which might make some claim upon us, which we can't simply revoke at will. Now, historically, there's a constellation of causes of this phenomenon, but I think it is worth mentioning in particular the role of consumerism, which insists upon the freedom from any obligations that might inhibit consumption, which is essentially about individual choice. Like consumer products, relationships, marriage, even our own biology can be exchanged or discarded according to personal preferences. Our individual will can sublimate everything to itself and must have absolute freedom to choose from issues of identity, life, death, biology, and so forth. By contrast, an active, historically rooted community makes claims not only upon who I am, but also upon my resources, makes claim upon my time, my abilities, my money. Now, I'm not for a moment arguing that individual identities or individual freedoms are bad. Indeed, the dignity and the worth of the individual and the importance of an individual's relationship with God are central teachings of Christianity. Rather, my point is that the cultural moment that we're living in has become hyper-individualistic because we have detached the individual from the historical stories of which the individual is a part. This hyper-individualistic search for authenticity turns us inward and undermines the idea that we're part of communities which have a story. If I'm primarily a self-determining person, effectively detached from community, then there's little point to studying history, which is the story of communities in various forms, of peoples, nations, classes, movements. A recent conversation I had with one of my undergraduate students illustrates this really well. We're having a conversation about the British Empire, I teach a lot on the British Empire, and he said at the beginning of the semester, "Why should I study British Empire? It has nothing to do with my life." Ouch. Now, a generation or so ago, it would have been obvious that the point of studying history is to understand the history of peoples and empires and countries and then to make sense of who I am in light of these larger stories. But the premise behind my students' question is that the way we make sense of our world is through taking me as the starting point. We are not understanding ourselves as historical beings anymore, largely, as part of communities formed through time. And this is why I've called this feature of the crisis of history, the death of the historical subject. We're ceasing to be historical subjects. And I think this accounts in no small part for our historical ignorance. Enrolments in history subjects in the HSC and at university are falling. In no small part, I think, because we've ceased to understand the point of studying history. Okay, the second feature of the crisis of history in our culture, I've called the death of the meaning of time. Now, understanding the past and doing the work of history, and here I don't just mean academic history, relies upon the sense that time has a meaning beyond that for which we create for it. And so the second feature of the death of history in our contemporary culture is that we're losing the shared stories that give time meaning. We tend to think of time increasingly as a matter for our own individual moulding. To paraphrase Stanley Hauerwas, in modern liberal societies, the only story I have is my own. Time is another force to be brought under our own aegis. And for those fortunate enough to be healthy and affluent in the West, time and its consequences can largely be fashioned for our own ends, or even effectively denied, which is one of the reasons why we idolise youth and obsess about minimising the ageing process. Now, there are complex reasons that account for this phenomenon. And indeed, to some extent, this is a broader feature of liberalism and modernity. I will point just briefly to the long historical process and processes of secularisation, which the philosopher Charles Taylor has described as replacing a transcendental framing of time and existence, right, a kind of vertical one, a transcendental one, by a flat or horizontal worldview in which the only things that exist are natural and immanent, that is, they belong to this world. In this worldview, the only purpose to time is that which is immanent, to draw upon Taylor. In other words, one that exists in this world and which we, of course, create for it ourselves. Now, decades ago, when the language of postmodernism and post-structuralism in the academy entered our vocabularies, philosophers and cultural theorists observed that this idea of eternally living in the present was one of the key features of postmodernism. They pointed out that there are no longer any great or meta narratives that order time. And that situation has been accelerated by the increasing dominance of the digital and the online world, which really underscore this sense that we live in the present moment. Social media, for example, enables us to create our own and curate our own stories and then simply recreate them at will. So this loss of a sense of the transcendent purpose of time has serious consequences, not only for those deep issues about how we understand time itself, but also for the very business of ordinary living. The transcendent stories that once shaped the seasons of our year, that gave rhythm to our lives like Christmas, Easter and Passover, are converted into mere consumer events. In shopping malls and in the world of marketing and online advertising, our years are now defined by cycles of consumption. Without its history, for example, Easter has become a disembodied event, floating somewhere in March or April as disconnected frivolity. In short, we have lost the shared narratives that gave time transcendent meaning. And then the third feature of the crisis of history, I've called the inability to grapple with the ethical complexities of history. This third characteristic of our crisis of history is that we're losing the ability to engage with the ethical complexities of the past. What I mean by this is that we are left with crude categories which impoverish our ability to wrestle with the coexistence, even in the same historical process or the same historical figure, of both good and evil. Now, I speak from some experience lecturing on the history of the British Empire, which I think is an excellent illustration of illustrating the problems we have in wrestling with the legacies of good and evil. We're increasingly treating history either as only the story of power and oppression, or ignoring moments of oppression and whitewashing faults or failings of any movement or person or people. And this is one of the reasons why it is almost impossible to have a civilized discussion or a debate and disagree with each other without being labelled or put into a box. If we do attempt to recognise the sins of the past, we risk being dismissed as taking part of the black armband version of history. And if we attempt to recognise the good of a movement or a person or a people, then we run the risk of being dismissed as whitewashing the past or being triumphalist. This polarisation is often referred to as a kind of version of culture wars. And one of the things I'll be suggesting tonight is that a Christian vision about how to go about the practice of history, both scholarly history, but also in the way that we treat the past in our daily lives and in communities, will actually go some way to enabling us to move beyond the culture wars. This polarised situation stems partly from the fact that our culture is impoverished, as I've mentioned, conceptually when it comes to wrestling with issues of power and authority. So in other words, what is the right and the just use of power? And I would suggest that this is because we've actually lost the meta-stories that show us what the proper and just use of power and authority ought to look like. One key facet of the way that we practice history today is the unmasking of structures of power. So to put it another way, when we go about the study of history, this goes for history as it is taught in schools and universities, but often also popular histories, a key question is often, who is wielding the power? Now, unmasking structures of power is not in itself a bad thing. And indeed, the idea of history as in part a critique of power belongs not with the 18th century European Enlightenment, as we might expect, but actually with St. Augustine's City of God, written in the 5th century AD. That book, The City of God, was a critique of the Roman Empire, which used power for its own glory. But in that book, Augustine also gave a story of what power ought to look like, embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, Christ implored his followers that they must not treat power and authority like the Gentile rulers do, who, in Jesus' words, lord it over them. Indeed, Jesus says that even he, God incarnate, came into the world not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The proper use of power is through humility, self-sacrificing service, and the care of the most vulnerable. But this is one of the stories that we've lost. And it leaves us, I think, conceptually impoverished. History, as the unmasking and critiquing of power, was then given fresh impetus by the Enlightenment, whose Kantian motto, Sapere Aude, dare to know, questioned the authority of all established institutions. And by that, Kant intended the church and the monarchy and so forth. And part of the upshot of this is that only our own individual reason, it was thought, was necessary to attain knowledge. Now, importantly, Kant was no relativist. He argued in the necessity of the existence of God. But then gradually, over the past 300 years or so, the use of critical reason, of which history is one example, to liberate ourselves from all authorities and then to pursue our personally defined freedom, has become unhinged from any overarching story about the proper use of power and authority. And so we're left fumbling around with these crude categories of, for example, victims or oppressors, or indeed triumphalist history too, with its categories, unable to articulate the coexistence of good and evil that is so often a part of the past and indeed part of the present. So just to summarise what I've talked about in this section, the death of history, I would argue, amounts to a crisis. We are ceasing to live as historical communities. We've lost the shared cultures that provided a sense of transcendence and meaning. And we're increasingly ignorant of the past, impoverished by crude categories and unable to deal with ethical complexities. Okay, now in section 2, I want to talk briefly on a section called The Effect of this Crisis on the Church. And so I want to briefly point out 4 ways in which I have some concern that this culture of ahistorical self-expression is creeping into some parts of the church today. Now, I won't spend much time on this topic here. However, for those who are listening who are Christians, I would like to flag this as issues for reflection and thought and discussion, because part of the Christian life is to humbly reflect on how we're living. Okay, so the first kind of effect I've called the fact that we're losing serious discipleship in the church. I think one of the ways in which this ahistorical culture is beginning to affect the church in some parts is that we're losing a sense that Christians are set apart as a distinctive community which practices spiritual disciplines which for centuries have shaped how Christians embark upon the difficult task of living a life in which they are being conformed to the image of Christ. In short, I fear that we've largely lost our practices and traditions of Christian formation. I'll give an illustration. I'm encountering too many young Christians for whom an app with the verse of the day is the extent of their daily Bible reading, and indeed, more broadly speaking, their Christian formation. They don't really know how to develop the disciplines and habits of prayer, nor how to be present and indeed vulnerable in community with others. Oftentimes too, they're not part of thick Christian communities. What I mean by that is that they don't have many deep relationships with older Christians who can disciple them. There's a kind of thinness to their faith, not just in biblical knowledge, but actually in the way that we in the church are discipling them and teaching them the habits and practices of the Christian life. Okay, the second effect, again, I'll just outline these briefly, is the entertainment and therapeutic individualistic model of church. I'll explain that for a moment. This turns following Jesus into a kind of form of self-expression, comfort, and self-help. Kind of talked about those ideas earlier as kind of characterizing our culture. This is a kind of acculturation. When this happens, and it's not everywhere, but when it does happen, worship services become increasingly therapeutic in the sense that they're geared towards providing a satisfying and entertaining experience. And when this happens, a whole host of orthodox biblical doctrines, teachings, ideas, but also practices are jettisoned. So, for example, there's less Bible reading, particularly of difficult and culturally uncomfortable passages, less teaching of biblical but challenging ideas, from marriage and sexuality to God's wrath, the existence of hell, to Jesus' demands for helping the poor. And it also means that the biblical and historical practices of formation that might make people feel uncomfortable are increasingly dispensed with. So, for example, prayer confessing our sin, praying aloud together, or even making a creedal statement of faith, perhaps also sometimes celebrating the Lord's Supper. The other result, too, is that this kind of therapy culture forms congregations in its image. It becomes increasingly difficult for pastors and others to speak prophetically against comfort and give the uncomfortable call to obedience, to pick up one's cross, deny oneself, and follow Jesus. Okay, the third effect is the consumerist marketing model of church. Now, this effect is premised upon a consumerist principle that we ought to accommodate worship services, in particular, to fit the desires and expectations of a potential consumer, effectively. And often it's closely related to the idea of maximising numerical church growth at all costs, particularly often, unfortunately, the cost of making serious disciples. When this happens, and again, it's not everywhere, but when it does occur, churches devote increasing time and resources to marketing, branding, and social media, and often to corporate models of leadership and church growth. I think the digital world, particularly social media, is particularly involved here. And that's because social media works through algorithms of engagement, which necessitates a constant devotion to the perpetual cycle of providing appealing digital content that will get likes and shares. And so we become preoccupied with curating our image effectively. Now, the other worrying corollary of social media is that because it is driven by popularity, the church presents or is encouraged to present only what will be attractive and appealing. And so this marketing model slowly reorients the church's heart and its resources towards marketing its brand and away from the very unglamorous and oftentimes prosaic business of daily denying the self, following Jesus, pastoring to the congregation, and humbly serving one another. Now, the fourth effect, and the last effect I'll just briefly outline, is the disembodied and depersonalized approach to ministry and discipleship. This tendency is exacerbated by the uncritical embrace of technology, which often replaces in-person relationships and practices of formation. In-person relationships require more time and more emotional energy than mass-marketed and on-demand training through digital means. And I'm finding, worryingly, that this phenomenon especially affects our youth and young people, even in their 20s, because they're increasingly disconnected from older adults in the church. They have fewer positive examples of the way to be a faithful follower of Jesus as an adult, because there's really a move away from intergenerational relationships and discipling. So in sum, to summarise this section, I fear that some parts of the church risk embracing forms of this ahistorical therapeutic individualism of our contemporary culture. And I think we ought to be attentive to the ways that this culture threatens to reorient our heart and our desires. The church risks losing her ability to be God's distinctive community, set apart from the world and inhabiting her story, the biblical doctrine, narrative, way of life and spiritual practices. So, is there any hope? Is there a way of recovering a Christian orientation toward time and history? Well, I think there is, and this brings me to the third section, which I've called History and the Hope of Christianity. When I was reading for my doctorate at the University of Cambridge, I was struck by an image and a phrase that the 17th century chemist, Robert Boyle, who, by the way, was one of the founders of modern science, used to describe the task of natural philosophers. In his work, The Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things, written in 1688, Boyle proclaims that natural philosophers, we might now use the term scientists in this context, were to be priests of nature. Now, to frame his idea, Boyle quoted Psalm 8 and then proceeded to explore its significance for the systematic study of nature. Psalm 8 reads, "Thou hast made him," so this is referring to mankind, "God has made him, thou hast made him a little lower than angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thine hands, and hast put all things under his feet." Now, Psalm 8 is referring to the commission given by God to humanity in Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 to 28 read, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fishes of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." Humans were to have dominion or stewardship over the creation and extend human flourishing, culture, and civilization, and God's presence all over the world. Adam was given the job of tending and keeping the garden, the creation, Genesis 2:15. And for Boyle, this commission shaped the purpose of studying nature. It was the natural philosopher's task systematically to study nature and to help fulfill God's ordinance that humanity take responsibility for the creation and make it useful by improving the conditions of human life. This was nothing short of a vocation, a calling. To Boyle's mind, undertaken properly, the task of the natural philosopher would help alleviate human suffering and help repair the brokenness of the world created by sin. It glorified God. Now, even though I was an atheist at the time, I remember thinking that there was something beautiful about Boyle's idea. The whole enterprise of the systematic study of nature, which, by the way, as I've said, shaped the origins of modern science, had an ultimate good and a purpose and was rooted in the ultimate story. Boyle's epistemology, that is his understanding of knowledge, its character, its methodologies, its purposes, was shaped by his Christian faith. Now, during this time when I was at Cambridge, reading Boyle, studying for my doctorate, in my own life, I was privately examining my own beliefs, and particularly whether there was any great purpose to the study of history. I was brought up in a very loving secular home, and by the time I arrived at Cambridge University, I defined myself as an atheist. I've written about my conversion from atheism to Christianity elsewhere, but I'll briefly note here that I realised that Boyle's Christian faith provided him with a compelling vision of the ultimate meaning and purpose in life and of the world, and therefore of his own vocation. I had a gnawing sense that my atheism could not provide me with the same. Years later, and now as a Christian, Boyle's image of the scientist as priest of nature, who tends and keeps God's creation, studying it for the good of humanity and the glory of God, is taking on a further significance for me. It has been enormously helpful for me in thinking through what the purpose of studying history is, not just academic history, and how it might help the Christian church speak into this current crisis. Boyle's metaphor for the vocation of the natural philosopher was that he was to be a priest. But what does this mean? What is priestly work? Well, in the Old Testament, priests were given the task of taking care of and tending and guarding the temple, which was the place where God's presence dwelt. The theologian G.K. Beale has argued persuasively that this priestly image and work runs all the way back to Genesis and through to Revelation. Beale argues that Adam and Eve were in fact effectively the first priests because they were endowed with the responsibility of tending and keeping the Garden of Eden, where God's presence dwelt. They were given the task of extending the garden to the rest of the creation. And Beale points out, and I'll quote Beale now, the two Hebrew words for cultivate and keep are usually translated into English as serve and guard. And when these two Hebrew words occur later in the Old Testament, without exception, they have this meaning and refer either to the Israelites serving and guarding and obeying God's word, or even more often to priests who serve God in the temple and guard the temple from unclean things entering it. End of the Beale quote. So Adam and Eve were to tend and keep, or in other translations, work and watch or serve and guard the garden. Now, after the fall, when the first couple were banished from the garden because of their sin, God, in his mercy, would still come to dwell with his people. But it was in the tabernacle during the Israelites' time in the wilderness, and then in Jerusalem's temple. Now, we're no longer in Old Testament times. It was a central Reformation principle that because of Christ's death and the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in every Christian, we are now a priesthood of all believers, to quote Martin Luther. Luther was expounding here upon 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, which says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light." So this priestly task of tending, guarding, and stewarding and spreading the wonderful light of God's presence to the whole world belongs to each Christian individually, as well as collectively to the gathering of the followers of Jesus. In other words, the church. So, drawing upon Boyle's idea of priests of nature and the Reformation emphasis on the priesthood of all believers, I want to suggest that Christians are called to tend and guard time. The priestly vocation of tending and guarding is key to understanding what I want to suggest is a Christian approach to history, both academic and the way that we deal with the past in our lives. I think we are called to tend and keep, watch over, and cultivate the past. This is a beautiful commission as well as a responsibility. Christians are called to watch the past and guard it, but also to be a witness to the past, to cultivate it, to keep uncovering the stories and the ideas that make up the history of the world. Now, on the one hand, this vocation is conservative in its call to keep and watch. It involves guarding traditions, passing down our heritage, both as the doctrine of orthodox biblical teachings, but also spiritual habits. It honours the past. But on the other hand, this priestly work also involves the work of cultivating, that is, tending to the past. This involves the work of uncovering the past, giving voices to the historical stories of people sometimes overlooked, bringing historical injustices to light, as well as recognising the sins of the past, including our own. Now, I want to suggest that this Christian approach to history can assist us in dealing with the crisis of history in our culture. One of the results of the crisis of history, as I've mentioned, is that there is this simplistic tendency to reject and erase good if it is tainted by anything oppressive or unjust. This black and white approach to the past, in which historical figures are either victims or oppressors, is crude. And yet it seems our culture lacks the ability to have a constructive engagement with these issues without deteriorating into culture wars. Approaching the past through the priestly responsibilities of tending and keeping time enables us to recognise and, where necessary, repent of sin without falling into the trap of seeing the past purely in terms of victims and oppressors, or indeed triumphalism. So let me give an example. In every town in the American South, there are statues to the Confederacy, to generals like Robert E. Lee. This is something that my family knows well. My husband is a seventh generation Floridian. And when we travel back to the American South, these statues prompt us to have difficult conversations with our children about the Civil War and about racism. Pulling down the statues, however, is merely tearing down a symbol of that worldview. Removing the statue doesn't remove the often racist worldview that erected the statue in the first place. Indeed, understanding why the statue was built in the first place enables us to discuss the legacy of that history. It reveals, for example, much about the post-Reconstruction South, that statues were built to the Confederacy. It's misguided to try to erase aspects of the past. I would suggest leaving the statues, but I would suggest building another one or a memorial on the same site, near it, that describes the pains of slavery in this case and the need for America in the Civil War and afterwards to reckon with the sin of slavery and the effects of racism on the South ever since. Now, I'll give another example. The second way that approaching the past through the priestly work of tending and cultivating assists us in the current crisis of history is that we're able to guard our history that may be forgotten. I find that some of the most animated and engaging discussions that my students have at university relate to the history of human rights. My students love the idea of human rights, and in class they make passionate statements about our need to defend them. And yet here is the very odd and sobering fact. They know virtually nothing about where human rights came from historically. Now, the fact that my students know nothing virtually about the actual history of human rights, I think is one of the strangest and most disturbing and also tragic aspects of the crisis of history. Now, if we taught students this history, They would understand that human rights find their origin in biblical ideas of equality and the dignity of every human life. They're found in the Genesis creation narratives, which articulate that every human being bears God's image. That was the foundation. That history develops in the early church when it was the Christians who insisted that all lives were precious, and this explained, for example, their rescue of infants, or those infants who had been routinely, through exposure, been left out to die. Also explains the earliest argument, the first argument, by Gregory of Nyssa, that slavery was in fact wrong. Arguments for rights subsequently developed in the medieval natural law tradition, in Reformation political theology, and were secularised, though very haphazardly, in the 18th century. Even then, though, the idea that these rights exist because they are endowed by their creator remained at the core of even the more secular articulations. For example, the Declaration of Independence in the United States. This idea of human equality and dignity lay at the core of various historical movements then, not least the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire and slavery in the British Empire, which was led by evangelical Christians. And yet, for all their love of human rights, my university students know virtually nothing of this history. In our schools, therefore, we must learn about the ideas and history that shaped us. This enables us to understand how some ideas from other civilizations and cultures, too, were negotiated through dialogue into our own evolving traditions. So tending and keeping the past and guarding the past enables us to understand our heritage. It enables us to ask, what do we value and why? And this means that we must engage with the past and read the great books and learn how and why we agree, or critique them. From Aristotle to Aquinas, Dante to Dostoevsky, Nietzsche to Mary Wollstonecraft. We must, like priests, tend and keep the past. For Christians, we need the doctrinal and the intellectual rigour that emerges from being rooted in the historic Orthodox Christian tradition. This will help us resist the tides of culture that undermine biblical historic teachings of the faith. And this means reading and wrestling, not only with the great thinkers of our own traditions, like Luther and Calvin, but more broadly too. We ought to read Virgil and Locke, Augustine and George Herbert, Marilyn Robinson, and also Wendell Berry. Now finally, the priestly work of tending and guarding the past also means giving voice to stories that are part of history, but which we have overlooked. My own research recently gave me an exciting example of this. In 1927, Australian Indigenous evangelical Christian leader and Ngarrindjeri man David Onayapon, together with a small group of evangelical Christians, made the first argument that Indigenous Australians had rights to their sacred places and objects of worship. It was in the context of some sacred stones, or Turengi, which had belonged to the Arrernte people of Central Australia and had most likely been stolen and turned up in Melbourne to be bought and sold on the private market. But then there was this group led by David Onayapon and the Christians, largely, arguing for their return. And they argued for the return of the Turengi to the Arrernte people on the basis that Aborigines, like all human beings, were entitled to their sacred objects of worship. The key claim was that Indigenous practices and places of worship ought to be afforded the same protection as Christian cathedrals. This episode, which is completely overlooked by historians, constitute what I would argue, and it appears to be, the earliest case of an argument for the religious rights of Indigenous Australians. This is one example of an overlooked but important story about an important idea, religious freedom. And religious freedom in this case for Indigenous people in this country. It is the kind of story that we need to cultivate, tend and keep. So, just to summarise this section, we've seen how a Christian priestly calling to tend and keep the past can help Christians, I think, with the crisis of history in our culture. And now, in this last section, I want to explore how this call to tend and keep time is relevant more broadly to the Christian life. And so I've called this last section, Tending and Keeping Time, the Habits and Practices of the Christian Life. We must not be ignorant of the ways in which secular society orders our time for us around the needs of the economy and those things that our contemporary culture holds up as worth pursuing, notably leisure, comfort, and entertainment. We've already seen that Western culture punctuates years through hollow opportunities for consumption. So how can Christians live lives that honour time as God's gift to us, in which time is God's story rather than our own invention, and like priests, we tend and keep time? What follows is a vignette. It's a little illustration of some of the ways in which Christians can live as a distinct community, or try to live as a distinct community, who order our time and our lives in their daily habits and practices around God's story. Historically, the church has used three main methods of tending and guarding time: a daily rhythm of prayer, Bible reading, and worship, a weekly rhythm of gathering, working, resting, serving, and worshipping together, and a longer rhythm that forms our years into seasons, liturgical seasons, around the biblical story of Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection. Historically, different denominations have developed their own names for these rhythms, like the divine hours or the divine liturgies. My own tradition, I happen to be Anglican, and I would suggest Anglicanism, following J.I. Packer, is one of the richest and also the most accessible for Bible-believing Christians. These rhythms are articulated in the daily office and the Book of Common Prayer. So what might the year look like? For millennia, Christians have observed a church calendar with seasons which enable Christians to shape their own lives around God's story and the rhythms of living collectively together as God's people. Advent, for example, is a season of anticipation and expectation in which we anticipate the birth of Jesus, the God who is born to dwell among us. In Advent last year, for example, our family incorporated the practice of an Advent wreath into our daily evening prayer, and our small group gathered, got out instruments and sang carols. Young and old, musically gifted and not so musically gifted, singing together in joy from small children to 70 years old. Christmas is a celebration, 12 days long, of feasting and giving thanks. Lent, for us in this picture, is a season of fasting and preparation in which we engage in spiritual disciplines, prepared for by fasting and service, and a service where we mark one another's foreheads with ashes. That physically embodies the fact that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. Then there's Holy Week with its Maundy Thursday liturgy, in which, following Jesus' washing of his disciples' feet, my husband washes our feet. The somberness of the Good Friday approaches with the Stations of the Cross and Tenebrae, which is a service of shadows, which leads to an Easter vigil before dawn for a sunrise Book of Common Prayer service, lit by candles and made brighter by the rising sun as we read the great sweep of the story of God's creation, the fall, God's revelation to Israel, his prophetic promises, and the fulfillment of all his promises in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And indeed, his final promise of a further return to put this world to rights and personally to wipe every tear from every eye. This, by the way, that little image there is what we do in our home with our small group. It's not a worship service in church. Now, time doesn't permit me here to give any more of a kind of brief vignette, but I hope to have illuminated something of the rich kind of distinctiveness of this life, in which the story of God's mercy toward all his people, saving anyone who chooses to turn to him, is brought from the written word into the practices of daily life, from abstract sketch to full colour. And then what might a daily series of habits and practices look like? The Book of Common Prayer sets out what's called the daily office, the hours of prayer throughout the day that echo the ways in which the early Christians attempted to actually use their worship of God to structure the hours in their day. The daily office is a series of prayer liturgies in the Anglican tradition developed by Thomas Cranmer in the Protestant Reformation, drawing upon the historic practices of the early church. In our family, we happen to do morning prayer and evening prayer together, My husband John does compline and hymn singing with our children when they're in bed. Each of these prayer liturgies involves reading a psalm, an Old Testament chapter, and a chapter from the New Testament. The kids almost inevitably have lots of questions about the Bible chapters, so we talk about it. We often kneel in prayer, we stand to confess our faith and say the creed, and we take turns in the Bible readings. This is a quiet, calm time with no technology, where we're immersed in the scriptures and in prayer while in the posture of worship. Personally, we've found that the daily office gives order and a beautiful rhythm to our days, which is markedly different from the way that our culture and our world would have us spend our time. It brings a sense of stability that comes from the Lord. No matter what else is going on in our lives, we'll gather and do morning and evening prayer. The peace we have in God is independent of these circumstances. Living into this story by trying to order our lives around God's story like this gives us and gives our children the knowledge that being a Christian is not just about what you believe. It's about being adopted into a family with a story. It's about a way of life that should frame our time and frame our habits. In a society which turns us inward to discover ourselves, and in which we are increasingly atomized in our digital online world, the practices of the daily office take us out of ourselves. As we pray prayers that have been prayed for hundreds of generations of Christians before us, we join a community, a people, and a story that is far larger than ourselves. And then the last little vignette I'll give is weekly rhythms. And so there are the weekly rhythms of meeting together in a small group from church during the week, Sundays for worship, and then a Sunday lunch and hospitality. For a number of years, we've hosted one of these small groups in our home. One evening a week, our group meets at our house to share a meal and to care for one another, read the Bible and pray together. The evening begins with breaking bread together in the form of a potluck dinner, to use my husband's American terminology. So it's potluck because the idea is everyone brings their own plate of food and therefore it is potluck, what you get. So we have various allergies in our small group from church and dietary restrictions: gluten, dairy, tomatoes, nightshades and cumin. But we work around it. And in fact, in our group, there is a running joke that it's either Stonebreaker chicken or Stonebreaker beef every Thursday for dinner, because that's the dishes that our family's worked out that everyone can eat. Our small group is a partial but beautiful picture of God's people who come from all ages and multiple ethnic backgrounds. The adults in our group range in age from 18 to 70, and the children from newborn to 11. Our places of origin in the past year have been Australia, America, Tonga, Samoa, and West Africa. There are single people and married people, grandparents, and university students. In contemporary society, we would not move in the same circles, let alone be spending Thursday evenings and Sundays sharing meals together, praying and reading the Bible together, supporting one another, and inviting others to join us. What unites us is our fellowship in Jesus Christ. The New Testament calls us brothers and sisters because we are a family. And because of this, we share the joys of new babies, the suffering of illness and death, as well as the very ordinary aspects of daily life. We try to exhort each other, not merely through conversation and encouragement, but in the act of meeting together and intentionally encouraging each other to live as God intends us to live. And yet, of course, we fall short. How are we doing in our marriages? How are we doing living as the single man or a single woman who follows Jesus? How can we be helping each other to serve our neighbours and God's people? How are we falling short? These are personal issues, intimate even, and it's not always easy to talk about them in a group. It takes a good degree of time and trust and commitment to develop that kind of deep fellowship where we can have these kinds of conversations and build these kind of relationships. Every Sunday, after the morning church service, we have a bring a plate lunch at our home. These lunches are an opportunity for our small group to eat together again, but this is also an open invitation. Everyone is welcome, whether we know them yet or not. We've been hosting these lunches every Sunday for a couple of years, And actually, we began them a couple of years ago during a season of suffering in our church when our minister, Greg, was dying of brain cancer. Meeting multiple times a week gave us another opportunity to bear each other's burdens, as Jesus put it, to care for one another and to live through suffering together. Then at 3 o'clock after lunch, those who want to stay on and join us, we do evening prayer together from the 2019 Anglican Book of Common Prayer. This has become an invaluable way of trying to tend and keep our time. The Sunday lunches and prayer after church have been one way that our community is trying to live into the story, our story, as God's people who are set apart from the rest of the world, yet who always welcome in the outsider. We certainly don't do this perfectly by any means, and there's much more that we ought to be doing. But I'm trying to paint a picture of some of the ways in which we're trying to live into our historical story. And in fact, the story of Ruth, the Moabite woman who chooses to follow her Hebrew mother-in-law, Naomi, back to Israel, is a beautiful example of the openness of God and this idea that being part of God's people means constantly being open to welcoming in others, but you welcome them in not just to a series of beliefs, but a family who live differently. Ruth's story is about a stranger welcomed into God's family, and Ruth's story in turn points to the larger biblical story that since the fall, we humans at one time or another are all strangers from God. But we have a God who came after us and who invites us to be part of his people. And this is important. We're not doing all this because we think somehow that this earns us God's favour or a place in heaven. No amount of good works or hospitality will do that. It is only the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ which enables us to be made right with God and adopted into his family. In fact, the point is the opposite. We live so differently now because we have been saved into a family, into a people with a history. Now, what makes tending and keeping our time through hospitality possible on Sundays is that our small group work together. We share the meal preparation because everyone brings a plate of food. It's potluck again. There's more Stonebreaker beef or chicken. And together we talk to any newcomers and we work together to clean up afterwards. It is a beautiful thing to walk into your pantry during the week and find a bag of walnuts that Anne's left there for next time, and the feta cheese in the fridge, the boxes of paper plates from Kim and Rob. Then there are the leftovers sent home with whoever needs them. And I'll look over at the end of the day or the evening and see Adam stacking our dishwasher in his characteristically meticulous fashion, Steve taking out our garbage, Rob wiping down our benches, and Kate packing away the food. There is a glimpse here of something so beautiful, a community of God's people trying to live into their profoundly countercultural historical story of living time differently. In the eyes of our secular society, the habitual sharing of time, meals, homes, and our lives in a community that crosses ages and ethnic backgrounds makes no sense. It defies what our secular culture believes about the nature of time, private property, privacy, leisure, and friendship. In contemporary society, it is virtually unheard of to invite people, especially those you have barely met, perhaps never met, into your home, share a meal, pray with them, and then invite them back the following week with a group of people from your church. But God has made us into a new people. We were once strangers and enemies of God, but through Christ, God forgave us and welcomed us into fellowship with himself and with his people. Well, these Christian practices, which tend and keep time, I think they give us a glimpse of that ultimate banquet when God remakes the heavens and the earth, and all God's people, of all nations and all ethnicities, will eat together with the God who dwells with us. And this prompts my concluding reflection tonight. Contemporary culture, with its hollow ideals of self-fulfillment, gives us a crisis of history. However, there is hope in Christianity, hope in recovering the historic Christian faith, doctrine, and practices. Therefore, for Christians, let us tend and keep our time by living into that story, and let us invite others to come in, for there is always room at the Lord's table. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We've been stimulated. I've got lots of work to do now. I think I've got lots of things, books to read, and things to think and things to do. But we now have a time to ask some questions. Let me just. I'm going to go first because I'm standing at the microphone, and because I can. But there's a number of ways to do it. There are people who want to ask questions in the room. If you put your hand up, then Annette has got the microphone. If you come round, hold the microphone close to your mouth and speak into it, and ask an actual question, please. No lectures in response, right? I will stop you if you start ranting. Yes, we've got one lecturer tonight, and just ask questions, please. Though you can make, of course, observations to which Sarah might like to respond. You can also, both if you're watching online or if you're in the room, you can text me your question, and my number has gone on the screen or on the chat for those who are watching online. Quite a crew are watching online, so it's great to have you with us. But if you're in the room, my number is 04 06 415 556. So 0406 415 556. You might like to ask a question that way if you prefer not to do it in person. But my question, first of all, Sarah, is to do with you're criticising or critiquing our contemporary culture for sort of losing a sense of time, but there's more than one sense of time we might find in different faiths, different cultures. That's been lost. So Christianity seemed to develop a sense of continuous time in a sense which is different to mythical or legendary time that another sort of religious system might look at, where it just says the legends happened back there sometime, whereas Christianity has a different time. Perhaps could you comment on how do we recover one, why one, not the other, or are there elements of both in recovering the kind of tending time in the way you mean it?
Right. I think I'll get up again. Here we go. Okay, that's a really interesting question. Okay, so yes, it is true that there is a very distinctive understanding of time that develops in and through Christianity. It is a linear conception of time, and there are historical and theological reasons for that. And I think one of the things that Michael's trying to get at there, and imply, and sort of implicitly what you're talking about, is the fact that so one of the distinctive things about the Christian worldview when it breaks into the sort of stage of world history is that the Christian worldview premises not the idea that there's just this kind of cyclical, never-ending series of periods of decay and change and empires rise and empires fall, but rather in the Christian worldview there is an ultimate story in which there was the beginning of time, there was a moment of creation, we are in time, and then actually one of the ways that I often explain this idea when I teach medieval history to my university students, I need to kind of understand this, is that Christians believe we're living towards the end of time, but we are not yet at its conclusion. And that linear understanding of time is also at the root of where we have many of our modern concepts of the idea of progress coming from. There's a whole series of historical scholars who've talked about the idea that progress is a kind of secularized idea of a Christian narrative of history. But then your question is about, okay, so this is a kind of distinctive understanding of time in the Christian worldview, and yet there are other kind of views of time. we seem to, and so I think you're also implying, well, we seem to be living in a culture in which we're kind of losing different sorts of time too. And yeah, that is clear. I was at the Australia Zoo with my family a few weeks ago, and I've noticed that one of the ways that they're trying to incorporate Indigenous culture is talking about deep time and like what are called storylines, which I think is a way in which Indigenous cultures in that community near Blacktown, where the zoo is, are trying to revive their traditional understandings of time as well. I think it's, so I would agree that there are other visions of time, and time is part of all kinds of cultures that have been lost. Because I'm a Christian, I believe that the sort of true story that explains time is the Christian story. So that doesn't mean that I don't think that there are beautiful things about thinking about deep time and learning about other cultures. I think that that is very important. And indeed, when we are trying to understand Indigenous history, for example, very important to try to understand, well, how did they understand time? Or indeed, when I teach medieval history and we're looking at the Greco-Roman lineage, and there's a cyclical and circular vision of time there, we need to understand those other forms of time. And those things are part of other cultures and important to other cultures. I personally believe that the truth about our story about time is the Christian story, and that it's that vision of time, ultimately, in which there is a beginning and a purpose to human life, which is the one which is most important to, and it's the only one for Christians, that we need to be talking about and trying to recover. This is a Christian enterprise, recovering time, and so Christians ought to recover a Christian vision of time. One of the reasons why it is the most compelling and profound understanding of time is not only is it the best description of how time actually has unfolded, and I speak there as a historian talking about ideas of progress, and yet this kind of sense at the same time that that every society that tries to approximate the good inevitably falls short. And so there is a sense in which this is borne true by history, but it is also, I think, the most beautiful and truthful story about time too. It is a story that tells us that the world, that history has a purpose, it's God's story. There was a moment of creation, and we have all in some way rejected God's story, God's rule, and actually that history, speaking on a kind of grand scale, is really the story of redemption. It's a story of God going after people, all of his people who have rejected him, and putting this world to right again. And one day, that process is nowhere near complete. One day it will be consummated. And I think that vision of time is the true one and the most compelling.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to turn it over to people who've gathered with us here. If there's anyone who'd like to ask a question, there's Rachel. Annette, Rachel?
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for an incredible lecture. To premise this, I am a humanities teacher, teaching history, English and Christian studies, predominantly Christian studies at the moment. And I have seen firsthand youth who are hungry to recapture the transcendent understanding of time. I was teaching about Shabbat today, for instance, with Year 9, and they were hanging off every word, wanting to understand how they could find something of the meaning and purpose of setting aside time for something beyond themselves. And they couldn't understand it, they couldn't comprehend it. So how do we help them? How do we actually, on a grand scale, rather than just one lowly teacher in a classroom, actually help our youth understand the beauty and the value in that transcendent understanding of time? How do we give that back to them in the culture we're currently in?
Yeah, wow. It's Rachel, isn't it? Yeah, thank you, Rachel. That is such a fascinating question and such a fascinating illustration too into what young people are yearning for, this sense of transcendence. I think the way that I would respond to you, it depends on the context, and I'm unsure whether you're speaking as somebody who is ministering to, like, are you in a Christian context where you can speak openly and you're trying to kind of encourage young people in their faith or not? Yes, you are, okay. Because that would, of course, alter my answer, because what you do, when what you can do differs.
Most of them not Christian.
Right, but you,
Christian school, but most of them.
okay, but you're in a Christian school. I mean, I think finding ways to draw their attention to those aspects of the faith which point so beautifully to that which is transcendent. And sometimes that can be through, like, have they read beautiful like, it's actually through art and poetry and sometimes music. Have they, for example, listened to some of the beautiful Christian music that came out of the Reformation? They could listen to early church music, they could listen to J.S. Bach. You can sometimes, and I'm trying to sort of think a little bit out of the square here too, because it seems, they're young people, and I think there are ways in which you can really use art, beauty, maybe the poetry of George Herbert, reading poetry, and even going to a place which draws you out of yourself and draws you out of the kind of relentless ordinariness and mundane, prosaic nature of everyday life and draws you upwards to God. I would draw upon, obviously, like it goes without saying that, of course, you're teaching them the Bible and you're pointing them to the Bible, and many of the, like, for example, when I talk about George Herbert, or when I talk about the poetry of Nicholas Ferrar, or some music like Thomas Tallis. Tallis has a piece called If You Love Me. And you know Tallis. I mean, this is so, so beautiful. And sometimes I think we can forget the way in which there's a kind of yearning for transcendence. There's some just suggestions. I'll try to keep it brief, but yeah, we could keep talking perhaps.
Thank you. Another question. Stuart.
Hi, my name is Stuart. Should Christians be into counterculture, which is love, justice, and mercy, or should we be following the world, which is cancel culture, and with some commentators like to say our Christian religion being threatened by all these other groups, or Christian religion is being threatened by Western civilization, etc.
Thank you. So I think we're talking the kind of, are we a threatened group,
Yeah.
cancel culture, or alternative culture? Where do we sit? There's something weird in what you just described about
Yes,
about the Christian
it's a bit
life.
weird.
Are we embracing the weirdness?
I think we ought to embrace the weirdness. Look, there are various responses to this sense that there is a kind of moment in the Western Church in which the question for Bible-believing Christians is, well, how do we respond to this? Do we kind of withdraw into our own kind of counterculture? I think perhaps, Stuart, that was one of the things that you were alluding to there. To what extent, and how do you actually relate to culture? There are other people speaking into this space too. I was trying to give sort of one illustration of some of the ways that, look, I work in a secular university in which vast majority of my students are non-Christian. In fact, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost, I'd say 98%, 99%. But those who do have a religious affiliation are Muslims. I mean, so the image that I was, or the little kind of picture I was drawing is not of a complete withdrawal. I'm still in the world. My husband has a law firm, in the business world. But I think there are ways of living as Christians in the world without cutting yourself off from society. But the question is, it will still involve, I think, a certain kind of weirdness. I mean, Michael's just helpfully, thank you, described us as weird. There's still a kind of weird, like weird in terms of how do we spend our time. And so I think there's a degree of weirdness. Can we still live in culture and hold down jobs in professions? Yes. I think that will change, though. I think this is a moment in which, this is a kind of moment of change.
So I grew up in the 80s when, I know, I don't, you're all supposed to go, really? At that point. And when we were trying to make church and Christian life look as untranscendent as possible.
Yeah, okay.
So the point was we never preached a sermon from a pulpit, we got rid of the kneelers, we were as ordinary as possible. And I think we wanted the point of weirdness to be different.
Yep.
Was that a mistake, do you think?
No, I don't think it was a mistake. I mean, clearly, in this context, like we're now at a very different historical moment in 2022 than we were in the 80s. And I think there's a lot to be, like, when you look at the ways in which Christianity has been able to grow in Australia, and I'm assuming this is a Sydney Anglican upbringing, no prizes for guessing that. Like, this is the way that Christianity was able to spread in the 1980s. And it's a kind of, so historically speaking, there was a kind of moment of cultural relevance for the church then. I think things have changed. I'm not the only person who's kind of observing that, that moment of cultural relevance, I think, has changed, because now our culture is, so different and so, aggressively anti-Christian, that to remain ordinary and to remain, and particularly actually the increasing naturalization of the culture, in other words, the kind of sense that there really is nothing outside of matter in motion, it's becoming more and more dominant. And I think now that we ought probably to be doing things differently. Weird doesn't always mean high church in services. I happen to go to a church that's not high church at all. The weirdness is entirely in our small group. We take full responsibility for the weirdness. But I think that the cultural moment is different. But here's another kind of illustration of weirdness. So, like I mentioned, like I grew up in a very secular atheist family, and I remember that one of the main obstacles, quite apart from the fact I was very new atheist philosophy, like big fan of Peter Singer, all this change, but in terms of like kind of worldview idea, one of the primary reasons why I kind of it took so long to get to the Christian faith was my sense that nothing outside of matter in motion existed, that there was nothing transcendent at all. And so in that sense, like I was so acculturated that actually, and I remember this, the first time I walked into a church as somebody who was earnestly seeking God, it happened to be a church which was very weird and high church, but it was precisely the fact that it was so transcendent. And look, I was a student of history. They were, I think, singing Renaissance music, and suddenly my heart and my conscience realised that the transcendent, that God did exist, but it was being taken out of the ordinary. Mm-hmm. And I think too, and I'm hearing similar things from young people today about there is no transcendence, there's nothing spiritual. So I think today we're in a different moment in which it's the big battle, and therefore the big opportunity for Christians is in Western, very secular, naturalistic societies, is one to show that no, there is a transcendent, holy God who loves you and became fully flesh in Jesus.
Thank you. Some other questions? Matthew.
I think she started to answer this question, but I'll ask it again to see, or a different way. My name is Matt, and I'm an Anglican minister at a church that will not be named here. But I've spent time, particularly over the last, I'm from America and did Anglican ministry in an American context on Capitol Hill with a lot of young people. And what we really found was young people would hear this lecture and go, yes, yes, yes. This is why we love doing Lent with our kids. We love taking the Lord's Supper every week. There were evangelicals who were just flocking to the church calendar. it doesn't seem like that sort of sticks or is as appealing to me. It is to some people, but in an Australian context. Is there something different going on? Are we at a different moment? Like a lot of what you said as in an American context, I think you hear and you go, yes, we want to recover tradition, history, connection to history. Why isn't that happening here? Is it just coming, or is there something else going on?
It's coming.
So just keep doing
No,
the
no.
Lord's Supper.
Look, I wonder whether it is coming. I think some of this probably has to do with the fact that like church in America is its own, and Christian life, and particularly evangelical Christian life, is so, like, as you know, so different to Australia. And I mean, there are some similarities, but I think where it comes down to it, the idea that like a lot of young Americans, and there are books about, like Winfield Bevan's book, for example, there are books that are talking about, oh wow, Christians, young evangelicals are actually yearning for this. Like, why aren't they in Australia? On this issue, there's probably a kind of a different history there. I think there are some historical reasons. Historically, the Sydney diocese, maybe Michael can talk more about this, but because it's more about like, it's Sydney diocese type history, but there's been an association between evangelicalism and low church, and then for various reasons, those denominations that have not been biblical have often been, have sometimes had different kind of association. So I think on a grassroots level, there tends to be more of a sense that, ooh, that seems high church and therefore perhaps it might be empty. Which is like, but and it can be, I mean, any practice or ritual can become empty. And there are still liturgies and rituals that we use even in our like completely no church. When we think there's no liturgy, of course there's a liturgy. Getting your coffee before church is a liturgy. It's part of, like, it's a ritualized practice. It's what we do. It's not bad, but it's just we shouldn't somehow think that we have no liturgy. But yeah, I think there's a difference between the kind of recent history, and a very interesting one too, the recent history of evangelicalism in Australia versus America, where purely there's so many more Christians in America too. You've had people who have historically been very evangelical and yet have maintained certain practices, and same goes for Canada. Like if you look at, say, J.I. Packer or Eugene Peterson, like they're completely reformed and evangelical, and yet they are still doing what in parts of Australia we'd see as kind of, liturgy. Like, yeah. What's your take on that?
Oh, well, you're the lecturer. Well, I mean, there's a number of things. I think Australia is. I wonder how much of a different place we are. We don't have the Great Awakenings. We don't have the transcendental. With Ralph Waldo Emerson and that great intellectual movement. There's a sort of harshness about perhaps our environment that we fail to look and have this sort of spiritual sense even in our environment. We've disrespected it, perhaps not listened to our Indigenous fellow citizens very well. So there's all that sort of thing. And I think you're right, there's sort of evangelicalism has always been attached to denominations here. So we've met in buildings like this, whereas evangelicalism in America is kind of independent movement.
Yep.
So I wonder if there's I mean, there's all sorts of things we could talk about there. Yeah. So any other questions? Yes, Matilda. Annette, Matilda would like. Yeah.
Just on the point of looking at other ethnical cultures' impact on our sense of history and with Christianity, and you mentioned Indigenous in relation to Australian history, but one thing I've noticed is sorely missing, and that's the history of migrants in the 20th century who also came and shaped Australian culture. And I'm thinking about the migrants that came after World War II, who came to Australia because they were invited by the government to help to grow the economy and also to build up the nation. It's probably not remembered because it's politically incorrect, because it was labelled the White Australia policy. But I find it a bit sad that a big part of our cultural heritage is lost because we turn a blind eye to migrants who've shaped this Christian side of this nation, but who come from white cultures from other parts of the world.
Oh, yeah.
I just wondered what your comment on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It may well be true. Before you said the Christian part, I was going to comment. Actually, the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, I think, does a really good job of, has a number of exhibits that tell migrant stories, which is great. I've been there recently. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it does a really good job of that. But then at the end you said, oh, the Christian migrant stories. That's interesting too. Yeah, I guess that's the case. Brian Rosner, actually. So here's an example of a migrant Christian story. Brian Rosner, who's the head of Ridley College in Melbourne, is descended from migrants who converted to Christianity and then came to Australia after World War II. And that's part of his story. He's written about that, has a number of books, and a new book coming out, which he actually writes about that story. So that might be something that you're interested in. Yeah, that would be a good example, actually.
Thank you. Yes, Michael.
I'd just like to say how impressed I was by your description of your daily and weekly routine. And I'd like to ask, I think it's just terrific, but I'd like to ask whether other groups in your church have followed that, and to what extent you've been able to encourage this in other contexts.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm kind of smiling and looking at my husband there in the back. So there's a running joke between us that John has the Book of Common Prayer that we use. You can order them. It happens to be the Anglican Church of North America, because that's his heritage. That's his Book of Common Prayer, and so he orders them from North America, and then he gives them to people. And this is how the weirdness is going to catch on, by the way. And so he buys them, and so. But okay, here's the interesting thing. Look, there are people who, it's not for them, and that's fine. And yet, there are people who I think are finding parts of doing these kinds of things helpful. Well, the whole group does hospitality. Couldn't do any of that without them. But there's always a group who stay for evening prayer on a Sunday. We had small group. We had members for the washing of feet that John did, and there are people, and I think it's actually people of different generations, but I'm talking here especially of some of our younger friends too, and some of them who've become Christians in the last few years. And actually part of this talk is, so much of this and so much of this research project, it's a lot of thinking that you do about Christianity and reading, but also conversations that you have with people. And actually, one of the conversations we have is actually with a young couple and especially he's recently become a Christian, and he loves the Book of Common Prayer, and one of the things that he asked about was, after doing Introducing Jesus, was, I believe these things, but what does this look like in my daily life? Like, how do I live like this? And it really kind of struck us, as in Jonathan, my husband, and I, that, as broadly speaking, at Lower C Church, how are evangelicals trying to shape the habits and practices, especially of young people, especially of people who've become Christians? And then it's what are the alternatives to the Book of Common Prayer? And the thing that's kind of talked about is 15 minutes of quiet time, and that's not bad, but there's a kind of sense in which there's something offered here. There's a kind of richness that isn't being shaped by habits and practices that evangelicals are otherwise turning to.
Thank you. Have we got time for maybe one more? Michael?
Yep. Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate your astute cultural observation about the way that particularly young people, try to make sense of the world, where the world is discovered within the self. Your sense of the world is discovered within the self, and that's led to this death of history. And also, there's this lack of a story, lack of a transcendent story. But I wonder if, there's a move from this story to try to make sense of the world to a mission, my goal in life, or, it might be some of the politics or injustices or environmentalism.
Yep.
Would you be able to comment into that search for something transcendent but finding it in these?
Oh, but finding it, so you mean, yes, right, so that there are these kind of, if I'm understanding you,
Yeah.
what you're saying, are you sort of saying that to some extent people who aren't Christians can find this sense of calling in life and find it somewhere else? And well, there's a tendency to do that.
Instead of
Yeah.
finding it in a bigger story,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
part of a mission, a purpose, kind of.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I think we see that all the time. And to be honest, I became a Christian, like I've alluded to, in my sort of mid to late 20s. And my goal in life before that was, and I've always been a student of history and loved history, but that was who I was. I was somebody who found my meaning and purpose in life purely in history. But then I kind of realized, well, if history is if there's no story about what history is, then really it's just me finding meaning and purpose and doing something that I'm good. That does happen. I've seen it in my own life, and I think we see it absolutely in other ways that people do these things as well. Yeah.
Last question to you, sir. We're just waiting for the microphone.
Hello, thank you very much. I am most impressed by your ability to deliver on such a masculine topic, if I can say it. Because most of the times I've been to history lectures, they've always been among other men that are interested in these obscure issues of the past. But I'm impressed to see this. Thank you for delivering it in such a beautiful place here. This is my first time coming here. I must say I'm most impressed by what your ancestors have done here, this great Western civilization built all the way to the ends of the world. My name is Nick. I come from Macedonia. We were part of Yugoslavia.
Stravo.
Zdravo, kako si? So when I was born, it was the late 80s, and that's when my people decided to bring back in fashion giving to the children Christian names. Prior to it, my parents were born in the time of the 50s, when it wasn't fashionable to give a Christian name because of the Marxist ideas and the communism time of Yugoslavia. I hear that it was similar to the Soviet Union and all of those countries of that era. And what I have been observing, because I grew up in the 90s there, is that I was very fascinated by the history and the story of my people as well as the Christian faith. What I wonder about is how, once I came to this country 14 years ago, I noticed how it's almost like the history, the way it's observed, especially own history by you, Western-looking folks, it's like the black armband story. Why does that have to be the perception of a person of the history of your own folks? It's almost, I find myself often arguing for Western civilization with Westerners, and I take on the Western side of, come on people, it's not all that bad. I have heard this described as cultural Marxism. I don't know how realistic that is, but I do have experience with how the real Marxism ideas have influenced my folks into veering away from the Christian faith. So I'm just saying how I see it here becoming more like this, this cultural Marxism movement where it incentivizes or encourages only the black armband of history, especially the European one.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sarah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, yeah, look, that is a really interesting story. And I think what I've tried to suggest tonight is that there is a way of, with a Christian vision of history, moving beyond either having a kind of triumphalist vision of the past or indeed just seeing the past in terms of victims and oppressors. And that actually the key to that is to have a very nuanced understanding of the fact that actually good and evil, and it's really only a Christian worldview that sees humanity in terms of the fact that, to quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. But when that happens, we can hopefully have a much more nuanced understanding of the past.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Irving Stonebreaker. Well, let's applaud her and thank her for... Your lecture has been stimulating on a number of different levels, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that turns into written and published work too. We hope that we've provided some stimulation through our questions in that. I think you've really touched on something of utmost importance for our own society, our own culture, and also, but you haven't left Christians kind of sort of looking without challenge. We too are challenged seriously and deeply, provoked by what you've said, to be less ahistorical, to tend and care for time, just as part of our priestly duty as human beings, and in fact something that's then been recaptured for us as the Christian church has been gathered and given a commission to tend and care for all that God has created. So thank you very much for your stimulating vision here. I want to say too that here at St Mark's we're doing our best to cultivate time and tend for it, and I particularly want to point to Mr. Ian Trezise, who writes local history and is putting it in the Eastern Suburbs Life magazine. If you haven't seen those little articles about sort of forgotten people of the 19th century who are nation builders really, and had a connection here, were nation builders because of their, and influenced heavily by their Christian faith. He's given us just a wonderful insight month by month in those. So do pick those up if you haven't before. Was that a he here? Right, it wasn't just from Ian. So I'm, before I make a presentation to Dr. Irving Stonebreaker, I'd like to do two things. First of all, to advertise our marriage course, which is starting up very soon. And that's a great 7-week course. I think we're offering it both online and in person at different permutations. There's the online and there's the face-to-face starting in July and in August. Do take one of those leaflets if that's something you would appreciate, or if something someone you know would appreciate, our marriage course. But also, you will see these cards in the pews. If you'd like to respond to what you've heard tonight, or just let us know that you'd be interested in knowing about more St Mark's events, fill in this card, and you can either give that to me or leave it in one of the black boxes in the foyer, one of the offertory boxes, and we'd be delighted to be in contact with you there. Let me present Dr. Irving Stonebreaker with her.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And to thank you for watching online. We had a great crowd watching online, almost as many here online as there were here. And thank you for your participation, for your questions and your interest. And I'm sure we'll continue conversing over this challenging subject tonight and later. Thank you.